Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is the top 30 colorless utility lands for Commander. So utility lands are, lands essentially that do stuff that isn't just giving you mana, right? These are lands that are going to give you other abilities that you can use that can be very beneficial in your deck, and they are all colorless, all right? This entire list, I was very deliberate in making this list so that you could put any of these lands in any deck. This was originally going to be top 10, and then as I started doing it, I'm like, oh wow, there's so many good ones, a lot that I had forgotten about. And I increased it to 20, and then I increased it to 30, and there's still probably a lot of lands that I left out that are still pretty good. A few honorable mentions though. Griffin Canyon, if you are playing a Griffin tribal deck, so all you one guy out there who's playing a Zuberi Golden Feather deck, Griffin Canyon is an auto include for you. Also, Elephant Graveyard, regenerate target elephant, so if you are playing a Hamza deck or a Frankie Peanuts deck, make sure you include Elephant Graveyard in there. By the way, I'm being entirely serious, okay? These are auto-includes, okay? If you're playing a Hamza deck, Elephant Graveyard goes in your Hamza deck because it's going to regenerate your commander, and that's very important. And also Swarmyard, right? Another honorable mention, Swarmyard is going to regenerate, just tapping it is going to regenerate an insect, rat, spider, or squirrel. So check all of your decks and see if any of your commanders fit one of those creature types, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be tribal. Cathril, Aspect Warper, Mazarek, Crawl Death Priest, those are both insects, okay? And you're not doing anything tribal in those decks, I assume. Both of those decks can have Swarmyard in them because it'll regenerate your commander. But moving on to the actual list, coming in at number 30, Mage Ring Network. So adds a colorless mana. Also, you can pay one and tap it to put a storage counter on Mage Ring Network, and then you can tap it to remove X storage counters from Mage Ring Network to add X mana to your mana pool. So basically this is a storage land, right? There's lots of different storage lands in different colors. This is the colorless option, right? So if you're playing a colorless deck or whatever deck, this is a colorless option for building up mana, right? You just put counters on this and put counters on it. Coming in at number 29, Sanctum of Eternity. Again, it's a land, produces colorless mana, and it has a very unique effect, right? Return target commander you own from your battlefield to your hand. Activate this ability only during your turn. So there's two really important effects here, okay? First thing is you can bounce your commander back to your hand if you want to be casting it again. So my Sigrid, for example, my Sigrid deck has this in it because I want to play it, and then I'm going to return it to my hand so then I can use this ability again. A Maelstrom Wanderer deck is probably going to want this, right? Because Maelstrom Wanderer is mostly about those cascade triggers. So you're going to return it to your hand, so then you can cast it again. Also, don't forget this is return target commander you own from the battlefield to your hand. So if someone steals your commander, all right, if you're playing in a play group where you have a guy who likes to steal everyone's commander, this just bounces your commander back to your hand, right? It sort of is a defense against that strategy as well. Coming in at number 28, Opal Palace. So again, add one colorless mana, and also you can pay one colorless and add to your mana pool one mana of any color in your commander's color identity. So it's going to add essentially one mana of any color. If you spend this to cast your commander and enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone. So just puts +1/+1 counters on your commander. If you have a commander that wants that, any sort of Voltron strategy works fantastic in a Skullbriar deck because that commander you want counters on and they stay on, and also you tend to cast your commander a lot with that, right? So I would imagine Opal Palace is a auto-include in Skullbriar decks. Moving on, number 27, Karn's Bastion, and again, it has the add one colorless mana. Also, you can proliferate, right? This is a land that can proliferate. A lot of the lands towards the bottom of this list are more specific, right? So they are good, but they're in specific decks, right? This is obviously not going to be very good unless there's some way you can use that proliferate ability, but there's lots of decks out there that can use that proliferate ability. Coming in at number 26, Petrified Field. Again, tap to add one colorless mana to your mana pool. Tap it and sacrifice it to return a land from your graveyard to your hand, right? This can be really, really good. You can just use this to return a fetch land to your hand or something, but any of the other lands on this list you want to reuse, or if you have a deck, like for example, my Name as One deck, which relies heavily on Herborg and Cabal Coffers, relies heavily on Command Beacon. I have this in there because I want to be getting those lands back. Coming in at number 25, Forge of Heroes. Again, tap it for a colorless mana. And you can choose target commander that entered the battlefield this turn, put a +1 counter on it. If it's a creature, if it's a planeswalker, you put a loyalty counter on it. So similar to Opal Palace in that, you can put a +1/+1 counter. I like that you don't have to pay mana to use it. Again, I would probably also put this in a Skullbriar deck if I had one. Auto include in any deck that has a planeswalker as a commander, I think. Coming in at number 24, Cavern of Souls. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. Okay, again, you add a colorless mana to your mana pool. And tap to add a mana of any color to your mana pool. Spend this only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type. It can't be countered, right? That's the important part. So if you're playing a tribal deck, I think this is probably an auto include. I mean, just the add mana of any color is pretty good, but making your stuff uncounterable is really good. You can even just use this in a deck if it's not tribal, if you just have a commander that you really, really want in play. Maybe the guys in your play group like to counter it a lot. You can just stick this in play. Name whatever creature type your commander is just to ensure that it doesn't get countered and it gets into play. Coming in at number 23, Mutavault. Again, you're adding a colorless mana to your mana pool. There are a few lands on here where you don't add mana. That's why I'm mentioning that. And then pay 1 mana, Mutavault becomes a 2/2 creature with all creature types until end of turn. So, obviously tribal, again, you want this to be in a tribal deck. In other formats, it's a real powerhouse. I rated it kind of low. This is a card for me I've never personally used in a deck. I would put this in a mono green elves deck. I would put this in a merfolk deck. If it was 1 color or even 2, would I put this in an Edgar Markov deck? I don't know, probably not. It's up to for each individual person to decide, but it does go in a lot of decks. Coming in at number 22, Gaia Reach Sanitarium. This is a legendary land, which is important. Some of these lands are legendary. I actually threw this in my Niambi deck for that reason, just because it is a legendary land. Add 1 colorless mana. Also, pay 2, each player draws a card, then discards a card. I probably have this a lot higher on the list than a lot of people would, but I just think it's super important to have this looting ability on a colorless land because there's a lot of decks that want to be doing this. I have this in my Zerzoth deck. It's one of the best cards in that deck because I don't like the randomness. It allows me to get Zerzoth's ability without the random discard. I can choose and discard what I want. All my opponents are drawing, so I get 3 devil tokens. Also have it in my Offspring's Revenge deck because I want to be drawing and discarding and pitching stuff into my graveyard. So it can be great for either of those strategies. It can be great where you want your opponents to be drawing, where you want to be drawing and discarding, where you want stuff in your graveyard, where you want your opponents to be discarding. You can just put this in a Nekusar deck even. It just goes in a lot of decks. Next up, 21, Safe Haven. And this is sort of a secret tech of my own, a personal favorite that I've used in a few decks. I actually use this in Modern. This is a Modern legal card. This doesn't tap for mana, right? There are a couple of lands on this list that actually don't tap for mana. So you got to be careful with that, right? When you're including them in your decks. It doesn't count as a land essentially, right? Because it's not giving you mana. Pay 2, exile target creature you control. So there's a couple ways you can use this. You can just use this to save a creature of yours, right? Someone board wipes, you pay 2, you exile that creature. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can sacrifice Safe Haven. Any creature removed from the game with it is going to be put into play under its owner's control, okay? So you can just use this as your opponent board wipes, you pay 2, exile your commander, say for example, wait until your next turn, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice Safe Haven and you get your commander back. I have used this in Blink decks before. I have this a lot higher on the list than probably a lot of people probably think this is junk. I think there's a lot of ways to use this. Saving your commander is important. In a Blink deck, you can just have your Eternal Witness come in, and then because a 2/1 creature is useless to you in commander, you just exile it. Exile it immediately, and then on your next turn, you don't sacrifice, right? You can sacrifice this. It's a may, not a must. And then the next turn, you play your Wood Elves, and then you exile that with Safe Haven. And then the next turn, you play your Reclamation Sage, and you exile that with Safe Haven. Then you can, once you have 3 or 4 things exiled, you can sacrifice this at the beginning of your end step, get them all back at once. So it's just a very unique ability on a land, right? Coming in at number 20, Thespian Stage. And obviously, you can include Vesuva here as well. I think Thespian Stage probably is the better option because you can keep reusing the ability, right? Vesuva is going to come in as a copy of a land and then it stays that way. Thespian Stage, you pay 2 and it becomes a copy of target land, except it has this ability so you can keep reusing it, right? A lot of people will use Thespian Stage to copy their Cabal Coffers so they get double Cabal Coffers. For a while, I just threw Thespian Stage in almost all of my decks to copy other people's Cabal coffers, right? Because they're always going to have the Herborg and the coffers, and you don't need the Herborg because the Herborg turns all lands into swamps. All you need to do is copy the coffers with your Thespian Stage, and then you get Cabal coffers with the Herborg, right? So you can just use this to copy someone's Gaia's Cradle, copy anyone else's really super busted land. It doesn't have to just be your own. Coming in at number 19, Emergence Zone. Again, you could also include Winding Canyons here. They both tap for colorless mana. They both have similar abilities of essentially giving you flash, right? So, but Winding Canyons is going to give your creatures flash until end of turn, right? Emergence Zone gives all your spells flash until end of turn, but you have to sacrifice it, right? So Emergence Zone, you're going to pay 1 and sacrifice it. Spells have flash until end of turn. Winding Canyons, you pay 2, and only creatures have flash, but you don't have to sacrifice it, so you can keep reusing it. Obviously, you know, casting things at instant speed can be fantastic. Both of these cards can be used just to get your commander out, right? Which can be really important. I talked about, you know, there's certain commanders, like my Cosima, for example. I really, really want that at the beginning of upkeep trigger, so I don't want to cast it and then wait a whole nother turn till I get it. I can cast it with flash on my opponent's end step, and then right away I get to exile it. Damia, Sage of Stone is another one. That upkeep trigger is so important, and your opponents are going to try to remove it before you get to draw those cards. So casting it with flash, I think being able to cast Damia with flash is super important if you have a Damia deck. Coming in at number 18, Tyrant Sanctum, and this is another one that I think people probably think I'm crazy for putting this high on the list. I think it's fantastic, okay, because it can go in every single deck. Pay 2, tap it, target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. So again, every deck has a legendary creature, so this can go in any deck, right? And by the way, you can keep reusing it, right? That first ability, pay 2, target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. You can just keep putting +1. It doesn't matter if it's already a god, right? As long as it's a legendary creature. The second ability I think is even more important though. Pay 4, sacrifice Tyrant Sanctum, put an indestructible counter on target god. So first off, any deck where your commander is one of the gods that isn't indestructible. You know, I talked about in my Kaldheim review how, you know, the Locust God, the Scarab God, really powerful gods that people always want to be removing. They do have that ability where they recycle themselves or resurrect themselves, but it really slows you down if you got to keep casting them. If you can play them and then immediately sacrifice this to put a indestructible counter on them, it really makes your opponent's lives a lot more difficult to try to get them off the table. All of the gods from Kaldheim, not indestructible. There's a whole bunch of gods now that aren't indestructible. This is an auto-include in any of those decks. Also, you can just use this in any commander deck where you have a commander that you really don't want off the table. So it's going to be slower. You're going to pay the 2, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and make it a god. Then you got to wait the whole next turn, pay 4. Now that it's a god, you can put an indestructible counter on it. You know, it's a little slower, but you could also go that route too. If you're playing a deck, you know, maybe, again, your play group is always trying to kill your commander. This is a way to protect it in colorless. Remember, these are all colorless options, so they can go in any deck. Coming in at number 17, Field of the Dead. And this is one that I think a lot of people they just love this card. They think it's bananas. They would put it way higher on the list. I think this is very specific. I kept these very specific cards way lower on the list. I think this is a case of this card's so busted in other formats that people think it's also busted in Commander, you know, sort of like Jace the Mind Sculptor or something. It's okay. In certain decks, it's fantastic. Yes, in a Golos deck, this is an auto-include, I think. So for anyone who doesn't know, Field of the Dead enters the battlefield tapped. It adds 1 colorless mana, right? So right away, not great. It enters the battlefield tapped. That's bad. In fact, there's very few cards on this list that enter the battlefield tapped. This is one of them. Add 1 colorless. Okay, so a colorless land that enters the battlefield tapped is terrible. However, when Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you create a 2/2 zombie token. So in a deck, again, like a Golos deck, where you are going to have 7 lands with different names relatively quickly, then every time you put a land into play, you're getting a 2/2 zombie. Again, a 2/2 zombie is not super fantastic in Commander. In, you know, Standard or Modern, it's a lot more effective. It's good. I just don't think this is as good as people think it is. I don't even know if I should have put it as high as I did. I've seen people play this. For some people, this is, I'm just going to throw it in every deck. In a monocolor deck, this is terrible. You're never going to get a zombie off of it, and it's going to just enter the battlefield tapped and only give you colorless mana. Even in a 2-color deck, I don't think this is very good. I saw a guy with this in his Omnath Locus of Rage deck, and it just sat there and did nothing. And there's a deck where you're already making 5/5 elemental tokens, so why do you even need to bother with a card like this? Maybe in a 3-color deck you play this. That's where I would start. 3-color decks and up. And considering you're probably going to play a reasonable amount of basic lands in your 3-color decks, even then, you know, it's okay. And remember, you're playing a 3-color deck now, so this is a land. How many colorless lands are you going to put in a 3-color deck, right? It's preventing you from doing other things that you want to be doing. Yes, you can scape shift and go get a bunch of lands and go, and yeah, okay. I mean, yes, you can do things like that. So this is a card, you know, I put it where I did because it can be terrible and do nothing, right? It can just be a colorless land and then this was the battlefield tapped, or it can be phenomenal and give you 20 zombie tokens and you can win the game with it. Sure. So a lot of upside. Also, though, it can be really, really bad. To me, only works in specific decks. Coming in at number 16, Glacial Chasm. Another land that doesn't give you mana. Cumulative upkeep, pay 2 life. That's super harsh, right? When Glacial Chasm comes into play, sacrifice a land. Pretty harsh. So far, so bad. Creatures you control can't attack. Oof. Awful, awful, awful. However, prevent all damage that would be dealt to you, period. You just don't take damage ever from anything. That's super powerful. Again, this is a card that has a really powerful ability, however, is super specific, right? And you're not going to put this in every deck. You're going to put it in a deck where, you know, you can recycle it. A lot of people will play this in their Lord Windgrace deck or any lands deck where you can let it die once the cumulative upkeep gets up there and then get it back with your Crucible of Worlds or whatever. It has a very powerful effect where if you can make it stick, your opponents they have no recourse. They can't attack you. They can't do anything. So again, extremely high upside in the right deck, but in most decks, it's really almost useless. You're going to play it, and I don't know how long you're going to keep it around. I don't know. Once it goes to the graveyard, you probably have no way to get it back, right? You really need to have a deck that is built around this sort of strategy in order for this to work for you. Coming in at number 15, Bozaju, who shelters all. Again, this is a legendary land. Love the art. I remember cracking this in packs, and man, did I love the art. It was one of my favorite, I think. Just a really sweet looking card. Enters the battlefield tapped. Again, one of the few cards on this list that enters the battlefield tapped. Tap, pay 2 life. Add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. Okay, so right away you're thinking this is awful. It enters the battlefield tapped. You have to pay 2 life to use it. There is no other option. There only is the pay 2 life option, right? Add 1 mana to your mana pool. If that mana is spent on an instant or sorcery, that spell can't be countered. So that's really powerful. That's really, really powerful. And I put this a lot higher on the list than Cavern of Souls because I just think that usually for me, and I'll get into a little bit of my philosophy of deck building here, I will put a negate in my deck over a lot of other things just because I think that typically it is, you know, with the exception of Craterhoof Behemoth, you know, typically it is the non-creature spells that are really going to end the game, right? The expropriates and stuff like that. And if you really want to get that stuff through, this is a way to guarantee it, right? This is a way that I can pay the 2 life and guarantee my expropriate isn't going to get countered or whatever. Maybe you want to just cast a board wipe, right? And I know people will think this is great in a Spellslinger's deck, but this can be great in any deck, right? When I made my top 5 artifact and enchantment removal spells in green, I didn't put Corrosion Grip on there because I thought Split Second was an ability that you probably, 90% of the time, I think when you cast a Corrosion Grip, the Split Second is going to be irrelevant. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, in my play group, we have so many counter spells. And okay, so in that play group, then you probably want to play Corrosion Grip and you want to play Bozaju. This is another way if you want to guarantee to get those removal spells through, right? Next up, Hall of the Bandit Lord. Same set, same theme, right? Legendary land, comes into play tap. This time you have to tap it and pay 3 life. Add 1 mana to your mana pool. Really high cost for 1 colorless mana. If this mana was spent on a creature spell, that creature has haste. There is just so many decks, and I have seen this in a lot of decks. There's just so many decks where if your commander needs to attack, this is just crucial. There's people that, oh, pay 3 life, don't care. Comes into play tap, don't care. Because giving their commander haste is so important, right? Kalia of the Vast is one that immediately comes to mind. This is probably an auto-include in that deck. Atali Primal Storm, auto-include in that deck. I mean, you just have to have this card in that deck. Everyone's going to want to stop you from attacking, right? Any commander that has an attack trigger, or maybe even a connect trigger, like maybe you just want to hit with your commander, is just super, super important, right? I talk about this with 1,000 Year Elixir, how if your commander has a tap ability, you want to be using it right away. You don't want to have to wait a whole turn before you can use it. Same goes for any commander with an attack trigger. You want it to be attacking immediately. You want to have haste enablers in your deck. This is one of the best ones. It's a land, it's colorless, it goes in any deck. That's why it is so high on this list. Even though it is specific, it is so good in decks like that. Coming in at number 13, Homeword Path. This is one that, this was printed specifically for Commander because there was a lot of stealing going on. In particular, Blatant Thievery is a card that was rampant in the format for a while, and people would use it just to steal everyone's commanders, and then they couldn't get them back, and it just made the game unfun. This used to be one of those cards that I think people threw in every commander deck. Maybe not so much anymore. I don't think I have this in any decks. Again, this is a little more play group specific, I think. Coming in at number 12, High Market. Tap to add 1 colorless mana, tap to sacrifice a creature, you gain 1 life. So really looks underwhelming. I know you're going to look at this and you go, sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life? That's terrible. However, I've talked to guys that they put this in every deck. Again, you can use it just like with a Homeward Path, where if someone's about to steal your commander, you sacrifice it in response so you don't lose it. There's plenty of creatures out there that have dies triggers that you just want to make sure they don't get exiled so that you can sacrifice them in response. This is obviously fantastic in any deck where you want to be sacrificing creatures. You could literally put this in any deck. Yes, it does gain life also. It's a colorless option. It doesn't look like much, but it actually does a whole lot, and you can put this in any deck, and I guarantee you at some point you'll find it useful. Coming in at number 11, Rogue's Passage. Again, tap to add a colorless mana, pay 4, tap, target creature can't be blocked this turn. This land was, again, a lot more popular back in the day, probably would have been a lot higher on this list. I kept it out of the top 10 because it has really waned in the last few years. I think because Voltron strategies have waned a lot. Voltron decks used to be a lot more popular. I talked about Uriel the Miststalker, which was just a menace in the format when I first started playing. It was really difficult to deal with. Decks like that, I don't see nearly as much anymore. Maybe that's why I don't see this that much anymore. It doesn't have to be for a Voltron strategy. Again, this could go in any deck, right? This can just make any creature unblockable. If you want to be connecting with creatures, it can be really good. There's lots of decks out there that want to be connecting with creatures all the time. On to the top 10. Coming in at number 10, Reliquary Tower. You have no maximum hand size. That's it. Just a colorless land that taps for colorless mana, and you have no maximum hand size. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with this card. It's one of the most popular lands in the entire format, maybe too popular. I think a lot of people auto-include this in their decks. For me, I think this goes in specific decks. This is not an auto-include. I mean, how often are you actually going to have more than 7 cards in your hand? Unless you're playing a deck that does that, right? I just did my Hand Size Matters deck tech for one of my patrons. This is going in that deck because you can have 30, 40 cards in your hand at times. You need an effect like this. I just think that probably this card is overplayed. Yes, it can go in any deck. A lot of times, though, I think there are better options, though. Better options like number 9, War Room. This is a card that I've gushed about quite a bit ever since it first came out. Tap to add 1 colorless mana and pay 3, tap, pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity to draw a card. So again, I just talked about this in my colorless card draw video. This is just a card draw option for anybody. Whatever your deck is, whatever colors you're playing, even if you're playing a colorless deck. In fact, the less colors you have, the better this is, right? If you're playing a colorless deck, this is pay 0 life. If you're playing a monocolored deck, this is pay only 1 life. Just fantastic. This can literally go in. I shouldn't say this can go in any deck. Yes, it can. You probably aren't going to put this in a 5 or 4 color deck or even a 3 color deck. But I think if you're playing a 1 or 2 color deck, this is probably almost an auto include unless you're already drawing lots of cards. You know, maybe you're playing a Simic deck where you're drawing tons of cards anyway. Probably don't need this, but it does go in a lot of decks. And again, for me personally, I just love the ability of let's give people a benefit for playing less colors. So that's why I personally put it higher on the list. Coming in at number 8, Nesting Grounds. Tap to add 1 colorless mana, then pay 1 colorless mana. Tap, move a counter from target permanent you control onto another target permanent. Activate this ability only as a sorcery. So this is probably a lot higher on the list than most people would expect, and it is very specific. This is the highest card on the list for very specific strategies. And the reason why I put it so high is because there, as far as I know, is no other card in the game that does this, okay? This is move a counter from a permanent you control to another permanent, okay? This is not move +1/+1 counters or move -1/-1 counter. This is move any counter. It could be a lore counter, it can be an indestructible counter, it can be any kind of counter that you can move from one permanent to another. That can have significant effects, right? You can move a time counter from one permanent to another, and that can have significant effects, right? Even though this only goes in specific decks, because it is such a unique and powerful ability, I put it really high on the list. Coming in at number 7, Herborg, Tomb of Yogmoth. And yes, this is a colorless card. It can go in any deck. Legendary land. If you've never seen it before, it just turns every land into a swamp, including itself, by the way. You know, if you have this in your deck, it turns itself into a swamp, so you can tap it for black mana. You know, I wasn't sure where to put this on the list. Obviously, it is a incredibly powerful card. Typically, you're going to partner with Cabal Coffers. That's the combo that gives you tons of mana. But it is a colorless card, so you can put it in decks that don't have black and don't have Cabal Coffers. I have this in my Jamocha deck. It combos with lots of different cards. Angry Mob, for example, that's one of the combos that I use in that deck. It combos with Karma. A lot of people will put Herborg and Karma in their Darien deck, and you know, everyone else gets the damage. You get the damage, but you also get a whole bunch of soldiers. I don't know. I wasn't sure where to put it because yes, it does typically go with coffers, so it's seen as a black card. It just has a really, being able to turn everyone's lands into swamps is such a powerful ability. So it had to be high on this list just for that reason alone. Coming in at number 6, Maze of Ith. Again, this is another card that doesn't give you mana. This is, I think there's 3 lands on this list that don't give you mana. Untap target attacking creature. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by this creature this turn. You know, obviously, I doubt there's any commander players out there that haven't seen this in action. It is very common in the format. You know, this is one of those cards that it can just sit on the table and you just won't get attacked. People just won't bother. They're just like, I'm not going to attack him. Why would I bother? It'll just prevent the damage. So, right, it'll just sit there and basically you won't ever get attacked because people don't want to waste their attacks on you. Doesn't tap for mana. So again, you got to be careful with that. You know, I wouldn't include any of these lands that don't tap for mana. I wouldn't include them in my land count. Just think of them as, you know, a removal spell or something else, right? Coming in at number 5, Arcane Lighthouse. And now we're getting to the, you know, for me, these are sort of auto includes in every deck. And obviously it depends on, you know, how many colors you have and all that kind of stuff. But for me, the top 5 on this list are going to be cards that you could put in any deck. Arcane Lighthouse is a card that I put in almost all of my decks. I really don't like being, again, removal wins games, right? I say it all the time. So if your opponent's creatures have hexproof or shroud, you can't remove them. I don't like that. Ooh, that bugs me. When my opponent's commander has a Lightning Greaves on it, that really, really bugs me. I love Arcane Lighthouse. Detection Tower is another one that does this. That only prevents hexproof, right? They're phasing out shroud. So no, I don't think any new creatures are getting shroud. But so what? There's still lots of old creatures that have shroud, right? Lightning Greaves, a very popular card in the format, gives shroud. So Arcane Lighthouse is just straight up better. Taps for a colorless mana, and then pay 1 and tap until end of turn. Creatures your opponents control, all creatures your opponents control, lose hexproof and shroud. You don't have to just use this for yourself, right? You can use this for all of your opponents. You know, you can, again, you can play a politics thing here where someone sees you have an Arcane Lighthouse and they'll ask you, hey, can you, I'll remove that thing if you get rid of the shroud or the hexproof. This is just an auto include for me in almost all of my decks. Coming in at number 4, Blast Zone. Blast Zone enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. Then you can tap it to add a colorless mana, pay XX and tap it to put X charge counters on Blast Zone, right? So you're going to pay 2 mana to put 1 charge counter on it. You're going to pay 4 mana to put 2, and so on. Then you pay 3 mana and tap it, sacrifice Blast Zone, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. Why is this so high on my list? I have this really, really high. Even though this isn't an auto-include in all of my decks, this is an answer. I talked about this in my off-color removal. You know, there are certain colors that just can't deal with certain things, right? Blue doesn't deal with enchantments. Black doesn't deal with enchantments. Red doesn't deal with enchantments, right? Black and blue don't deal with artifacts very well. This is a way to solve that problem, okay? If you're in this is an auto-include in a mono red deck, I think, or a mono blue deck, where you want to be able to get enchantments off the board. That is why it is so high on the list for me, because it is a colorless option that can go in any deck that can solve any problem. Maybe not any problem, but it solves a lot of problems. I mean, sometimes you got to sit there and build up those counters and get like 6 or 7 on them if you want to get rid of somebody's really expensive enchantment. But typically, you know, you can just put a couple of counters on this, sacrifice it to blow up that Rhystic Study, or sacrifice it to blow up that Phyrexian Arena, or that Song of the Dryads that is locking out your commander. It just can be really, really good, right? I've seen a lot of people playing a mono red deck. Someone puts a Song of the Dryads on their commander, and that's it. Like, it's just, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing now because I'm playing a Krenko deck or a Neheb deck, and I really badly need my commander. Blast Zone is one of the solutions to that problem, right? And that's why I like it, and that's why it's so high on this list. Coming in at number 3, and the top 3 are all auto-includes. Command Beacon, you know, I mean, what needs to be said? You tap it for colorless mana, you sacrifice it to put your commander into your hand from the command zone. It was for a long time the only option for this, as I talked about in my Name is One deck. If you have a commander like that, right, this is just crucial. Phage the Untouchable is another one. If you're in any deck where your commander is important to you, this should be in your deck, okay? Again, it depends on how many colors you're playing. If you're playing an Atraxa deck, I don't know. 4 colors is a lot to start putting in lots of colorless lands. It depends on you. For me, almost all of my decks, I really, really want my commander. There are some decks where I really need my commander. I try to stay away from decks that have what I call monolith commanders, where I absolutely need my commander to be in play in order for it to do anything. I talked about Obeka and Yurlok, who I think are both monolith commanders because your deck really doesn't do much if they're not in play. Command Beacon needs to be in those decks, right? It needs to be in any deck where your deck is specifically built around your commander and your deck doesn't do much unless they're in play. It can go in any deck, right? It can go in any deck, but it really needs to go in decks where a commander is super important to you. Coming in at number 2, and this is probably going to surprise a lot of people, is Scavenger Grounds. I have, and I talked about this recently, I have sort of a couple of rules of commander deck building for me, and one of them is you have to be able to exile graveyards. When I first started playing Commander, Meren was number 2, I think, in the whole format. It was everywhere. If you couldn't exile a graveyard, you might as well just pack up and leave. I mean, it's just too powerful of an ability to let a Meren deck go crazy. Scavenger Grounds, you pay 2, sacrifice a desert, exile all cards from all graveyards. Scavenger Grounds is a desert, so typically I just sacrifice, well, not typically, that's all I ever do because I never have any other deserts. There are some other deserts. There are, the cycling deserts that some people will put in their decks. So you could reuse this more than once. Typically, though, I'm just going to sacrifice Scavenging Grounds as the desert. Bojuka Bog is going in my black decks. That's an auto-include in a black deck. I think you got to be able to exile graveyards. If my deck isn't black, Scavenger Grounds is in it. Any deck I have that isn't black is going to have Scavenger Grounds, because you just have to be exiling graveyards in any commander deck, I think, or you're going to come across that graveyard deck that's just going to go crazy, right? Not just Meren, there are tons of them that are taking advantage of stuff in their graveyard. Got to be able to do that in commander, I think. And the other thing you got to be able to do is destroy every other card on this list. And that's why number 1 for me is Strip Mine and or Wasteland. You know, I talked about in a video I did recently about how I don't play Strip Mine because it destroys basic lands. And people are like, well, you don't have to destroy basic lands. Yes, I know. You don't have to, obviously. You can just use it to destroy non-basic lands. I know it's a little bit nitpicky. Play Strip Mine if you want. The only thing is, again, in my experience, playing out there in the wild, playing online with people from all over the world. If you play a strip mine, it's just one of those cards that people go, ooh, is he gonna, crucible a world and then just strip mine lock me and destroy all my lands? It's just a mentality that people tend to have, whereas with Wasteland, you can only destroy non-basic lands. So that person at least doesn't have to worry about all their lands getting destroyed. It is a little nitpicky. You can do what you want. I also really like Ghost Quarter. What I really like about Ghost Quarter is you can use it on yourself, right? So I've done this a couple times where I will tap a land for mana and then I'll destroy it with my Ghost Quarter to go get a different color of mana that I really, really need, right? Typically for me, and again, one of these in a deck isn't enough in my opinion. In most decks, I put Wasteland and Ghost Quarter, especially in my monocolor decks, right? In my monocolor decks, I'll have both because there's always going to be the guy with the Gaia's Cradle or the Coffers or any of the lands on this list that you really, really want to get rid of, right? Maybe you have a Lightning Greaves on your commander and your opponent has an Arcane Lighthouse and you don't want them losing the Shroud on your commander because you don't want them killing it. So you got to get rid of that Arcane Lighthouse, right? Maybe your opponent has a Maze of Ith that you got to get rid of so that you can attack them, right? You got to. This is just an absolute staple in any commander deck to have at least one land that is going to destroy other lands because your opponent can completely lock you out of the game. They have that Glacial Chasm or they have that Field of the Dead and they're just going crazy and there's nothing you can do about it except destroy their land. I should also note, and a lot of people will go, hey, where's Ancient Tomb on this list? If it's just producing mana, I didn't put it on the list, right? This is utility lands. It's lands that are doing stuff for you other than just producing mana. I don't have any, Temple of the False God is another one. Anything that's just producing mana, I didn't put on this list. This list is 30 utility lands that you can put in any deck, right? If you have a colorless deck, you put all these, right? If I was making a colorless and Ulamog deck, I'll put all 30 of these in there, or maybe like 27 or 28 of these, and then throw a couple of basic wastes in there. How many you put in, I don't know. I mean, for me, if I'm making a monocolored deck, probably the top 5 on this list will go in. Usually 5 colorless lands I'll put in a monocolored deck. And then once I go up to 2 colors, now I'm looking at maybe 3, maybe 4. Again, it depends how important they are, right? If I really want a blast zone in my deck, right, I'm going to include a Wasteland for sure. I'm going to include Arcane Lighthouse probably for sure. I'm going to maybe want to put a Blast Zone in there. I'm going to include Scavenger Grounds for sure if I don't have Bojuka Bog, right? If it's not black, I'm definitely going to have Scavenger Grounds. Probably I want Command Beacon in there, unless it's a deck that I don't really care about my commander as much. Maybe I want War Room in there because I want to be able to draw cards. If it's a deck that doesn't draw cards very well, once you get up to 3 colors, I don't have a lot of 3-color decks. I don't have any 4 or 5-color decks, so maybe I'm not the expert on this. How do you put any of these in a 5-color deck? Like I said, Field of the Dead can go in a Golos deck. What else are you going to put in? Maybe Maze of Ith in case people are attacking you? I don't know. Because you can search for lands in a Golos deck, it's probably not that big of a deal. But what if you're playing a Kenrith deck, right? Maybe what if you're playing another deck that's 5-color? How many colorless lands are you going to put in that deck? I don't know. I don't think you could put any. I don't know. I mean, how many could you put in? How many do people put in? I don't even know. Even in a 4-color deck. When I used to make 4-color decks, I don't think I put any colorless lands in there just because it's so hard to fit, because being able to cast your commander and the other things you want to be doing are probably a lot more important than, using an Arcane Lighthouse on your opponent's creatures or a Wasteland or whatever. It's up to each individual person. Again, for me, I don't play a lot of colors in my decks. It's just the way I trended. And so it's a lot easier for me to be able to put a lot of these utility lands in my decks, which I really, really like because a lot of them can be fantastic. That is it for today. That is the top 30 colorless utility lands for Commander. Again, any of these lands can go in any decks. Feel free to play around with some. Some things are important to people, maybe not so much important to others. For me, I really like being able to target my opponent's creatures. That's why Arcane Lighthouse is on the list. Other people might think that Field of the Dead is so fantastic and just an auto-include in their decks. It's up to each individual person to do as they like. That is it for the day, and thanks for tuning in.